The light in an old photograph seems harmless, but sometimes it reveals what the darkness tries to hide. This 1863 portrait shows a happy family by the fireplace in a luxurious room. But at the edge of the photo, a black woman holding a tea tray stands there like a ghost in the frame. And only she knows. This is not an ordinary day. Thank you for coming to Sleepy History Tales. I am so glad you are sitting with me tonight from somewhere in the world, looking into the past. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like something in it was looking back at you? Because tonight, we will unlock the secret in that photo where every smile hides a farewell. There's an old photograph from 1863, a portrait of a happy southern family, frozen in perfect harmony. But what the image hides, what one quiet woman may have known as she smiled for the camera, would in time turn deadly. Sarah Chen, a forensic historian in Boston, spent her days studying forgotten images from the Civil War. One afternoon, she sat beneath the dim light of her office lamp examining a daguerreotype she'd purchased at an estate sale in Virginia. It was labeled simply, "The Whitmore Family, Richmond 1863. The image was everything Victorian society prized: order, wealth, serenity. Richard Whitmore stood tall behind his wife Constance, who sat gracefully in a velvet chair. Their two daughters, ages 12 and 9, posed neatly in matching dresses, ribbons perfectly tied. But behind them stood a fifth figure, a young black woman holding a silver tea service. Her name was not written anywhere. Sarah leaned closer. The woman stood not in the background as enslaved servants often were, but almost among them, centered, deliberate, present. And her face was not like theirs. The Whitmores smiled with practiced warmth, but the servant's expression was something else entirely. A smile that wasn't quite a smile. Controlled. Composed. And behind it, perhaps a glimmer of something defiant. Triumphant even. As Sarah tilted the photograph under the light, the silver teapot the woman held gleamed with an almost ceremonial brilliance. Mrs. Whitmore's hand was frozen mid-gesture, reaching for a teacup that would never be lifted. The family's smiles, once so charming, began to seem oddly stiff. Richard's eyes did not quite match his grin. One daughter's lips curved upward, but her expression hinted at pain. Turning the frame over, Sarah noticed faint handwriting in ink, faded by time, The Whitmore Family, April 14th, 1863. Final portrait. The word final lingered like a whisper. She felt a chill run through her chest. What did it mean, final? Within hours, Sarah was deep in Richmond's archives. Old newspapers, faded headlines. And then she found it. Tragic deaths of prominent family. April 15th, 1863. The article was brief but brutal. The entire Whitmore household found dead under mysterious circumstances. Authorities investigating. The photograph, Sarah realized, had been taken the day before their deaths. For the next week, she barely slept. She combed through more issues of the Richmond Dispatch reading, by lamplight, chasing ghosts through ink. And there, in an April 16th headline, it screamed, "Entire family. Perishes poisoning suspected." According to the report, a neighbor grew concerned after the Whitmore home had been silent for 2 days. When the authorities entered, they found Richard Whitmore, 45, in his study. Constance, 42 in the parlor. Their daughters Emma and Charlotte still in their beds upstairs, all lifeless. The bodies showed signs of violent convulsion. Discolored skin, bloody vomit, every indication of arsenic poisoning. At first, investigators suspected Confederate saboteurs since Richard Whitmore was a known Union sympathizer in an increasingly hostile Richmond. But then came another headline. 5 days later, one that shifted everything. Slave woman vanished prime suspect in Whitmore poisonings. Her name, the paper claimed, was Grace, age 26, mulatto complexion literate, skilled in kitchen and tea service. She had vanished the very morning after the photograph was taken, before the bodies were discovered. The article painted her as clever, dangerous, the perfect villain. They said she'd poisoned the evening tea, then fled under cover of darkness. A reward of $500 was placed for her capture, dead or alive. Soon came the rumors that she'd been spotted in Petersburg, that she'd joined the Union lines, that she'd drowned crossing the James River. Her story dissolved into myth, but as Sarah scrolled through each brittle headline, she noticed something chilling. Not one article had ever asked why. Why would Grace have done it? What life had she endured in that house? And just perhaps what had the glint in her eyes captured forever in silver and shadow really meant. Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring at the frozen moment in her hands. 5 figures, 4 dead, 1 vanished, and a photograph that for more than a century had smiled silently over a secret no one ever truly wanted to see. The narrative back then had been simple: an ungrateful servant, a benevolent family. Case closed. But as Sarah stared again at Grace's mysterious smile, that story began to unravel. Something in the photograph refused to stay silent. So she reached out to Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian from Howard University, whose work focused on tracing the real lives behind the names and numbers of the enslaved. She sent him everything: the daguerreotype, the newspaper clippings, the few details she'd uncovered. And then for 3 long days, she waited. When Marcus finally called, his voice carried an edge not of excitement, but of anger, held carefully in check. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I found her." Grace wasn't born into slavery. She was born free in Pennsylvania. Her full name was Grace Morrison. For a long moment, Sarah couldn't speak. Marcus continued, each word heavy. She was kidnapped in 1855 at the age of 18 and sold south through a ring of traffickers operating along the Mason-Dixon line. Sarah's stomach turned. "How do you know?" she whispered. "Philadelphia newspapers," Marcus replied. Her disappearance was reported that same year. Her father, James Morrison, was a barber, respected, well off. He placed notices for years, searching for her, filed complaints, reached out to abolitionists, even traveled to Richmond himself in 1857 trying to buy her back. The Whitmores refused every offer, claimed she was theirs by law. Sarah felt her throat tighten as Marcus sent the scans. There were Grace's original free papers, her birth recorded in 1837. There were the father's desperate letters written to Quaker abolitionists, and the rejections that came back from Virginia courts, each one colder than the last. Together, the documents told a quiet, devastating story. A father battling a machine designed to protect the enslavers, not the enslaved. But Marcus wasn't finished. "There's more," he said softly. "I found the probate records for Richard Whitmore's father dated 1859. Grace appears in the estate inventory valued at $1 to $200. It reads, 'House servant, literate, excellent cook and seamstress.'" He paused. That last word, literate, it matters. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Virginia. So either she hid her education, or they exploited it while pretending not to know. Sarah turned again to the photograph on her desk. The way Grace stood at the center, not hidden, but displayed now, looked different. Not inclusion, but possession. She was there not as a person, but as proof, an emblem of refinement, wealth, and power. And that gleaming tea service in her hands, it was not a prop. It was the very tool of her servitude, held out for the world to admire. Marcus, Sarah said slowly, "If someone had been stolen from her home, enslaved for 8 years, and denied freedom even as her father tried to rescue her, what would drive her to murder?" Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he answered softly. "The better question might be, what took her 8 years to do it?" That sentence lingered with Sarah as she traveled to Richmond to walk the streets where Grace had once walked, where the Whitmores had lived and died. The house itself was long gone, consumed by the fires that swept the city in 1865. But the address survived in brittle ledgers, 412 Grace Street. The irony did not escape her. At the Library of Virginia, she found something she hadn't dared hope for: a diary kept by a neighbor named Margaret Hayes. The entries, dated from 1860 to 1863, offered an unfiltered glimpse into that household, a world the newspapers had never cared to see. January 1861. One entry began. "Called on Mrs. Whitmore today. Found her in foul temper, striking her girl Grace for some trivial offense with linens. The girl endured the blows without sound, which only made Mrs. Whitmore angrier. I was mortified to witness it, yet I said nothing. These matters, I remind myself, are not my concern." Sarah read the words twice. Not my concern. The diary continued, each page darker than the last. Margaret described how Grace was punished for the smallest mistakes, denied meals made to work from before dawn until the late hours. How she slept in a cramped storage room beneath the stairs without heat, even through the brutal winters. But scattered among the cruelty were glimpses of something else: intelligence, quiet defiance, and grace that no amount of abuse could erase. March 1862. Another entry read, "Grace served tea with such poise that I complimented Mrs. Whitmore upon her servant's training. She replied coldly that the girl required constant correction, though I observed her anticipating our needs without a word. There is something in her eyes, a watchfulness that unsettles me." Sarah closed the diary and sat in silence. Somewhere beyond those words, the story that history had buried was beginning to stir. The smile that had once seemed enigmatic now felt like something far more human, something earned through endurance, through pain, through knowing. Perhaps Grace hadn't been smiling for the camera at all. Perhaps she'd been smiling at what she knew was coming. The most haunting words in Margaret Hayes's diary appeared just days before the photograph was taken. April 1863, she wrote, "Mr. Whitmore refused another offer to purchase Grace's freedom. A man claiming to be her father came all the way from Pennsylvania, offering $2,000, an impossible sum. But Mr. Whitmore dismissed him cruelly, saying Grace was too valuable and that he doubted the man's claim. I saw Grace standing in the doorway. Her face showed nothing but her hands. Her hands gripped the frame until her knuckles turned white. Sarah stared at those lines for a long time, her fingers trembling as she photographed each page. Grace had watched her final chance at freedom vanish before her eyes. Her father so close, he could almost reach her, turned away by one man's greed. And then 3 days later, the Whitmore family posed for their final portrait, smiling, elegant, and behind them, Grace, holding the tea service, the very instrument of their deaths. Sarah turned next to Dr. Rebecca Torres, a toxicologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, a woman who'd spent years studying the poisons of the 19th century. Sarah laid out the records, the newspaper autopsies, the accounts of agony, and asked the question that had been gnawing at her. What kind of poison could have done this? Rebecca leaned in, reading silently before answering. Violent convulsions, bloody vomit. Rapid death within hours, she murmured. This is classic white arsenic, arsenious oxide. Extremely common in the 1860s rat poison flypaper, even cosmetic treatments. Easy to get, easy to hide. Sarah hesitated. How much would it take to kill a family of 4? Rebecca's tone stayed calm. Less than a teaspoon. Dissolved in liquid, it could end multiple lives. The only challenge is masking the taste, slightly sweet, faintly metallic. But in strong tea, sweetened and creamed, it might disappear completely. She scrolled through old medical texts, the glow of her monitor, lighting the room. Here's the thing, Sarah, she continued softly. Arsenic doesn't kill instantly. It takes time, which means the person who used it had to stay, had to watch as it worked. That takes either unimaginable hatred or unimaginable despair. Sarah placed the daguerreotype on the table. This was taken the day before the family died, she whispered. Grace is holding the tea service. Rebecca studied the photograph closely. Look at Mrs. Whitmore's hand, she said. She's reaching for the cup. If this was an afternoon sitting and they died that evening or the next morning, then the tea Grace holds could already be poisoned. She's been photographed with the murder weapon. The thought hung in the air like smoke. Would she have known, Sarah asked quietly, what they were about to suffer? Rebecca nodded slowly. Oh yes. Arsenic is cruel. It burns from the inside out. Victims remain conscious, aware of every moment. The pain, the paralysis, the terror. If Grace did this, she knew exactly what she was condemning them to endure. Sarah looked again at the servant's face, that controlled, unreadable smile. It wasn't joy. It wasn't satisfaction. It was certainty. Grace had already decided. The poison had already been mixed, and the photograph had captured the stillness before the storm. The quiet poise of a woman who had already taken fate into her own trembling hands. But there was still one unanswered question. Where had she found the arsenic? It wasn't easy for enslaved people to purchase anything, much less poison. Their movements were watched, every transaction logged. That question led Sarah to her next discovery, one even darker than she expected. In the dusty archives of the Virginia Historical Society, She found the ledgers of Pien's Apothecary, a Richmond pharmacy that operated from 1830 to 1872. The books were meticulous line after line of inked transactions, and their dated March 28, 1863, was an entry that made her heart stop. Mrs. Constance Whitmore purchased white arsenic powder, 0.45, for rat infestation. The poison had been bought legally, freely, placed right into the hands of the woman who would later die from it. But Sarah kept reading. Between 1861 and 1863, Constance Whitmore had purchased arsenic 6 times, always in quantities larger than a household might need. The ledgers also listed laudanum, morphine, mercury, and tonics laced with the lead. Sarah brought the records to Rebecca, who frowned as she skimmed them. "This is troubling," she said. "It's a pattern consistent with what we now call Munchausen syndrome by proxy or addiction. Either she was poisoning herself for attention, or she was genuinely dependent on these substances. In either case, the poison was already there inside that house. Grace wouldn't have needed to steal it. She knew exactly where it was." Sarah returned once more to Margaret Hayes's diary. An entry from February 1863 confirmed it. Mrs. Whitmore again complains of illness, stomach distress, weakness. She blames the war, though. I wonder if her many medicines may harm her more than they help. She showed me her collection of remedies, a veritable pharmacy, upon her dressing table. Sarah read the line twice, feeling the slow chill of irony creep down her spine. The poison that destroyed the Whitmores had lived among them all along, in their home, in their vanity, in the delicate silver teapot that shone so proudly in their final photograph. The Whitmores had sown the seeds of their own destruction. They had enslaved a free woman, broken her body, humiliated her spirit, and fed daily from the very hands that would one day deliver their deaths. Every time Grace prepared their meals, she held the quiet power to end their lives, and for 8 long years, she didn't. Not until something inside her finally snapped. But what was it? What moment pushed her from survival to defiance? Sarah found the answer not in Richmond, but in an archive in Philadelphia. Among the files of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society lay a letter dated April 10, 1863, written by Grace's father, James Morrison. His handwriting trembled across the page. "Gentlemen, I have failed. Despite saving $2,000 over these last wretched years, Mr. Richard Whitmore refuses to sell my daughter Grace. He mocked my offer, called me an impostor, and threatened arrest should I ever return. I saw her through a window. She knew me, but she was forbidden to speak. Whitmore swore she would be sold south within the month, to a place where her improper aspirations would be corrected through fieldwork. God forgive me. I have failed her." Sarah read the words again and again, feeling the weight of her father's despair. This, she realized, was the moment. Grace had watched her father risk everything only to be turned away. Within days, she'd be sent to a plantation where death and silence were the only futures left. And then 4 days later, the Whitmores decided to take a family portrait, their final one. Margaret Hayes's diary confirmed the sequence. Her April 12th entry described the chaos in the Whitmore home. Some Negro man appeared claiming kinship to Grace. Mr. Whitmore sent him away with threats. Mistress Constance is furious and vows to sell the girl. Grace has been quiet ever since too quiet. There is something peaceful in her eyes which unsettles me. Peaceful because she had already made her decision. On April 14th, 1863, the Whitmores gathered in their drawing room. They dressed in their finest garments, arranged their finest china, and summoned Grace to hold the tea service for the photograph. She smiled faintly, the same small, knowing smile that Sarah would one day study. What no one saw was that the tea had already been laced with arsenic. The camera caught that single instant between decision and consequence, between empire and collapse. They believed they were recording their prosperity. Grace knew they were recording their deaths. Years later, Sarah found confirmation in a forgotten corner of the Library of Congress. Among thousands of WPA interviews with formerly enslaved people, she found the words of Clara Washington, age 94, recorded in 1936. "I knew a woman once in Richmond back in slave days. She poisoned the family that kept her. She was from up north, smart, could read and write. They treated her cruel, and one day, she just had enough, put arsenic in their tea and walked out while they were still choking. I helped her. Don't regret a thing." The interviewer noted Clara wept as she spoke and refused to give names. Through genealogical research, Sarah confirmed that Clara had lived just 3 houses away from the Whitmores on Grace Street. The timeline aligned perfectly. With Clara's help, Grace hid for 2 days in an attic, while authorities scoured the neighborhood. Then, through the fading light of a war-torn city, she was smuggled north, hidden beneath a cart of vegetables, passing from safe house to safe house, through Richmond's secret abolition network. By late April 1863, one record placed her within Union lines near Fredericksburg. After that, nothing. Grace Morrison disappeared from history as completely as she had once been stolen from it. The Union Army's policy was to treat escaped slaves as contraband of war, offering them protection, though life in the contraband camps was far from merciful. Disease, hunger, and exposure claimed many. And yet, in one worn register from the camp at Alexandria, dated May 1863, Sarah found a name that made her breath catch. Grace M. Female, 26, from Richmond. Literate, assigned to teaching duties for camp children. Grace had survived. She had crossed Confederate lines, navigated the chaos of a dying war, and found her way into fragile safety. The M almost certainly stood for Morrison. Somehow, amid a nation tearing itself apart, she had reclaimed her name. But what happened next? Did she ever find her father again? Did she live with the weight of what she'd done? The deaths of 4 people, including 2 children. Sarah's search led her north to Philadelphia, to the archives of Mother Bethel AME Church, one of the oldest African American congregations in the country. There, in the faded ink of 1865 membership records, she found it. Grace Morrison returned from Virginia, reunited with her father James Morrison. Joined congregation, August 1865. She had come home. After a decade of captivity and flight, 8 years enslaved, 2 years hiding and surviving through the war, Grace had finally found her way back. The church records went on to tell more of her life. In 1867, Grace married Samuel Peters, a teacher and activist. They had 3 children. She worked as a seamstress, then as a teacher herself, devoting her life to educating the newly freed. Her literacy, once a crime in Virginia, had become her greatest act of defiance. Sarah uncovered an 1875 issue of the Christian Recorder, an African-American newspaper featuring a report from a women's rights convention in Philadelphia. There, Grace Morrison, once a stolen girl, now a free woman, had spoken before the crowd. "I was taken from freedom and thrust into bondage. For 8 years I endured captivity, subjected to cruelties I will not recount. I was denied my name, my family, my very self. When every legal avenue was closed, when those who preached virtue practiced none, I took my fate into my own hands. I will not apologize for my survival. I will not regret the choices that returned me to freedom." The newspaper noted that the audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation. Grace Morrison lived until 1908. She died in Philadelphia at the age of 71, a beloved teacher mother and tireless advocate for her community. Her obituary mentioned her kidnapping and enslavement, but not the Whitmores. The Richmond murders had become a shadow she no longer needed to name. Sarah found one last photograph taken in 1890 at a family gathering. Grace was 53, her hair streaked with gray, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Her face was calm, radiant, unburdened. So unlike that mysterious smile in the 1863 daguerreotype, she had built a life. But Sarah couldn't help wondering, did the ghosts of Emma and Charlotte Whitmore still whisper in her mind? Could any person, even one who had suffered so deeply, truly reconcile the killing of children? She would never know. But Grace's own words seemed to hold the answer. "I will not apologize for my survival." Months later, Sarah stood before a crowded auditorium at Georgetown University. The 1863 daguerreotype loomed large behind her, its silver surface catching the light, like a mirror to another century. "This photograph," she began softly, "has been interpreted in countless ways since I discovered it. Some call it evidence of a crime, others an act of justice. I believe it's something far more complicated, a portrait of impossible choices etched in silver and glass." She guided her audience through the story. The kidnapping, the Whitmore's cruelty, the father's failed rescue, the threat of sale to the Deep South. She showed Margaret Hayes's diary. The apothecary records the letters and testimonies. She traced Grace's escape, her survival, her later life. Grace Morrison was 26 when this photograph was taken, Sarah continued. 8 years enslaved. Beaten, degraded, denied her humanity. When her father's final attempt to buy her freedom failed, she faced being sent to a plantation where few survived more than a handful of years. So she made a choice. Sarah paused, letting the silence settle. She murdered 4 people. 2 of them were children. That is a fact. But it is not the only fact. The full truth requires us to understand the system that created this moment, a system that declared human beings as property, that legalized kidnapping, and that left women like Grace with no recourse but defiance. The questions that followed were fierce. Some condemned Grace's act as unforgivable. Others called it a form of resistance, an assertion of humanity in a world built to destroy it. A debate raged over whether the Whitmore daughters could be seen as innocent when raised within a house of cruelty. Sarah offered no easy verdicts. "What I can tell you," she said quietly, "is that the Whitmores lived one more day after this photograph was taken. Grace Morrison lived 53 more years. Their choices to enslave, to abuse, to deny freedom led to their deaths. Her choice to fight back led to life and to legacy. Afterward, an elderly woman approached her eyes, shining with tears. "My great-great-grandmother was enslaved in Virginia," she said softly. "She never spoke about those years, but my grandmother said she once did what she had to do to escape. I never understood what that meant until today. Thank you for telling Grace's truth." Later that night, Sarah returned to her office. The daguerreotype sat under protective glass awaiting its transfer to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it would finally be displayed not as a curiosity, but as testimony. She looked one last time at Grace's face, that faint, enigmatic smile. Now she understood. It wasn't pride or even relief. It was certainty, the calm of someone who had already chosen to act, to survive, to reclaim what was stolen. The Whitmores had tried to reduce her to property, to a backdrop in their own story. But 160 years later, it was her story being told, while theirs had become nothing more than context. The photograph captured two truths suspended forever in silver: a family's final illusion of happiness, and one woman's first moment of freedom claimed through fire. Grace Morrison had refused to vanish into history. And perhaps in the end, that quiet smile was not just for her own survival, but for the justice she knew history would one day deliver.